Hello, Communication 321 students. This is our lecture about Chapter 4, and I'm going to introduce you to the Cultural Patterns Discussion Board and give you a little bit of a preview, a little bit more than what's offered on the course that I have online. We are in my wife's kindergarten classroom, because I have no access to the campus, and so that's why this is all on a whiteboard. And of course it's during COVID-19 time, and I have hair that is extremely long. Those of you who know me know that this is not what I normally look like. So anyway, I'm happy to be doing it in this style and offer you a little bit more of an orientation to the discussion board assignment number 5 about cultural patterns. So let's get started. I really like this chapter because I teach intercultural communication, and I've always thought that it's really hard to separate the two, intercultural and interpersonal communication. I think that you're basically trying to adapt to others and their view of the world and try to relate and empathize. And so, of course, you have a lot of the same concepts. So I'm going to start with a definition of culture, and there is a definition in your textbook. It has a lot of these elements that I've put on the board, and recognize that there's so many different definitions of culture. We're really going to focus on the social science, specifically communication definition of culture and how it relates to Chapter 4, okay? So first of all, it's learned that in a social science definition, culture isn't, you're not born with culture. It's not innate. You have to learn it, generally from your family structure, your folks who have served as your parents or parents' figures. So we're looking at beliefs, values, rules, and norms that impact your behavior, okay? And so it's a learned set of those beliefs, values, rules, and norms. If we're looking at beliefs, it's what's true or false about your world, based on, it could be religious doctrine, whether you believe in heaven or hell or karma or reincarnation. These are beliefs that have been explained through century-old beliefs. And then we have values, which basically answers the question, what's good or bad for us, what's right or wrong, moral or immoral, okay? And you have been raised with probably a value hierarchy in your family. Perhaps it's that, family first, or, higher education is extremely important or not important, okay? Rules. You have rules that are written explicitly. You might have, in my family, we talk about and have written out rules about you have to do your chores before you do something fun, okay? I have kids do 15 minutes of chores and 15 minutes of cleaning their room before they're supposed to do something fun. Now, that's the rule. Is it the norm? The norm is the behavior that's more implicit, more implied, and common. And no, it's not the norm. So you can look at traffic rules. The rule for speed limits. What is it? 65 miles an hour, right? But what's the norm? Right? 75, some of you speed demons probably going 80, 90. While you're looking at your phones. So anyway, these beliefs, values, rules, norms impact your behavior, and this is what Geert Hofstede, who is an intercultural communication scholar, called the mental software that we're programmed with, okay? And I think that's an important concept that, those of you who are into technology can relate to, the importance of software and how it really serves us, okay? I think that it's important to recognize that culture is much more, specific. A lot of times we think of culture, we think of, the U.S. culture, but obviously we recognize there's so many different co-cultures, also known as microcultures. And in communication, from a communication standpoint, we're going to look at the kinds of cultures, co-cultures, that impact you and your behavior and your ability to relate to other people. The co-cultures of your family, your friends, your teams that you've been on, the organizations that you have been a part of, the military, etc., all have impacted your mental software, the way you see the world. Okay? So, moving on. This is not in your textbook, this information about the 3 levels of culture, but I thought it was a nice kind of transition into cultural patterns. So, Stella Ting, Toomey, and Chung have their intercultural communication scholars that I think they break down this idea of levels of culture pretty well. Okay? The surface level of culture is, think about what's easy to obtain and easy to observe. Okay? A lot of times pop culture, television, music, you can learn about a culture in a very surface way, right? If you were new to the United States and you turned on television, you saw a reality show, you might recognize, wow, competition is really important here. Okay? Also, music. Music is easy to obtain. You can see the popularity of hip-hop in a lot of the suburbs, right? Well, it's a lot easier to obtain a hip-hop state of mind through music as opposed to in a more urban setting. So a lot of times you'll see and hear hip-hop songs and even the way that folks dress in the suburbs in, Granite Bay and Auburn and Davis. So anyway, you have that surface level of culture. Let's turn our attention to intermediate. And really, this is where we're looking at symbols and meanings. So you can think about language and the importance of language. When you start studying the language of the land, the language of a co-culture of, when you took Spanish, you know that you had that cultural element. You were learning about Argentina and Mexico, but at the same time, obviously, learning much more about the culture through the language. And so that would be the next kind of level. You're getting deeper and deeper into the study of the culture. Now, deep culture is really, we're looking at traditions that have stayed stable over time. And I'm going to keep repeating that phrase because that's really what epitomizes deep culture. It's stable over time. In 5 to 10 years, these values, these beliefs, these rules and norms are still going to be present. So if you think of on a macro level, the focus mainstream U.S. society, what values do you think will be present over in 5 to 10 years? Do you think competition, because that is one of the mainstream U.S. society values that I think we can probably agree on. Competition, you think that'll be around in 5 to 10 years? How about individualism? Individualism, the idea of freedom, the value of freedom, 5 to 10 years, you think that's going to be around? So I would say yes, and that's thinking about your family culture and what you have learned from parents or parent figures, what values, beliefs, norms have been imparted to you that you think will probably exist in your life 5 to 10 years, even passed down to children if you have children, right? So, I can think of, and I brought up earlier, family first, attention to higher education. These are values that I know my folks had definitely kind of drilled into me, and it's something that I'm passing on. So these deep level kinds of culture, levels of culture, is what we really call cultural patterns, okay? And you're going to hear me say that quite a bit. Remember, you're doing a cultural patterns discussion board, and this is what we're talking about. Not just the surface level, but what deep level kinds of values, beliefs, norms, and rules will be existing for years to come. Okay? Last thing I want to focus on, from a communication standpoint, we all have culture. They've been, from a variety of co-cultures. Okay? Personally, I know I've been impacted by academic culture. I've been impacted by Filipino culture and Swedish culture to a certain extent. Additionally, mainstream U.S. society and pop culture have impacted me. Team culture, definitely speech and debate culture. So there's so many different kinds of values, norms, beliefs, rules that have been kind of plugged into my mental software, created my mental software in terms of the way I see the world. So I often hear students, usually European American students, who will say, you know what, I don't really have culture. Actually, from a communication standpoint, you do. I hope this makes sense, and I look forward to hearing any questions you may have about these concepts. I'm going to move on to, now that we've established deep culture and basically equals cultural patterns. Okay, there's a term in your textbook that's used called taxonomies. And really what those are is they're cultural patterns. They're a way to categorize various behaviors, okay? And they're used because Edward Hall over here, who we'll talk about his ideas in a little bit, was an anthropologist. And anthropologists in science, we know they use taxonomies to categorize species. And so essentially what we're doing is we're talking about cultural patterns, taxonomies, and various ways to inform your mental software, if that makes sense. I hope it does. Okay? So we're going to use these terms synonymously, all right, just for clarity's sake. Let's take a look at taxonomies. The first, in your textbook, there's Edward Hall and Geert Hofstede. Okay, I'm going to focus on Edward Hall for this discussion, and then I'll go over Geert Hofstede's taxonomies in a different video. So Edward Hall, as I mentioned, was an anthropologist who focused on nonverbal communication. He studied nonverbal communication for a lot of his career. High and low context cultural taxonomies are, I think, an interesting discussion because you could probably relate to this. High context, and it's based on the situation, based on the context, is really related to collectivism. That they found a strong correlation between high context culture communication and collectivistic culture. So basically what we're saying is you have spent a lot of time around this person, around your family. Maybe you have a very tight-knit family or a very tight-knit group of friends. And you can basically read each other's facial expressions. You can finish each other's sentences is what they always say, right? So implicit messages versus explicit. Implicit is you're relying on nonverbals. You're relying on the situation, okay? It's not direct. It's beating around the bush is another way to phrase it. So there's an emphasis on nonverbal cues. Tells, let's say. So for instance, you use a personal example, a couple of them. My wife knows me very well. Been married almost 20 years now. And there are times where maybe I'm upset about something, but I don't want to bring it up. But she'll look at my face and she'll say, "Why is your jaw so firm? Why is this little mark? Why is that crease there? What's wrong?" And I'll just say, "Oh, I don't really want to get into it, but my nonverbal cues give me away." And you probably can know people that well where you can just look at them and recognize certain more subtle behaviors that mean something. I played poker quite a bit when I was a younger guy, and I remember having a friend playing with him for, over 5 years. And he kept me in lunch money, honestly, because he was so obvious. When he had a good hand, he would lean forward, right? His back would be off of the chair rest, and he would try to get the betting going really quickly, and he would say, "Oh, let's go. Whose bet is it? Who's ante?" You know what I mean? He would get it going, and I knew he had a good hand. Now, if he was trying to bluff, he was trying to act like he had a good hand, but he really didn't, he would lean back. And he would act a little bit slower and a bit more methodical. And I knew, he didn't have anything, so I'm going to go in and take his money. So, emphasis on nonverbal cues. In that way, it's high context. I knew the situation, Strong interpersonal bonds in high context culture is really important because, again, we're looking at collectivism. We're looking at people who spend a lot of time together. Now we're talking about your high school friends, maybe. Friends who've grown up with you. There's a lot of times we'll have, and I know we have this in our family, people who have been lifelong friends. I just have my kids call them uncle, auntie, you know. That's something that demonstrates a highly collectivistic kind of family, and as well as strong interpersonal bonds. Well, because relationships are so valuable, relationships come before your everyday tasks. So obviously time is more open and flexible because you are often distracted by these very strong relationships. They are of the utmost importance instead of getting to class on time, right? Or getting to work on time maybe. And that, you're going to put the people before the tasks. I remember I had an intercultural communication professor who ran into a colleague that he had a conversation with. He was about 15 minutes late for class, and he explained this idea that, this is one of my best friends and colleagues, and we had to continue the conversation. That was more important. So I hope that description of high context communication is clear. Please ask me questions either email or via my Zoom address. So let's turn our attention to low context. So with low context, we're talking about explicit, exact, and overt, meaning very direct kind of communication. And Edward Hall has identified that individualism, individualism is actually one of Hofstede's taxonomies, but individualism and low context culture are basically, there's a strong correlation, okay? So if you think of an individualistic culture, you don't spend as much time with the same people, the same group of people, right? You spend time with a variety of people generally, because you don't have that history with folks. You have to be much more clear and explicit, okay? I have email as, being an exact kind of communication, an example of an exact kind of communication. Because if you have one character off, it doesn't work, right? All the websites, very explicit, exact. Overt meaning direct, okay? Direct and explicit is what really we're trying to, in English and in communication, in speech and debate, we're trying to teach you to be much more direct and overt. By saying, hey, give me 3 reasons why this is correct. Well, my first reason why I'm right, my second reason why I'm right, and my third reason why I'm right, and it's a superior argument to what you have. It's very, very overt, right? There's no beating around the bush. There's nothing implicit about it at all. I hope that makes sense. So moving on to details are verbalized really explicitly, is that if you think about say the text of a proposition. I hope you all vote. I definitely hope you vote this November. And think about the propositions that you vote on, and you get the voting guide, and in the back you have the text of the proposition, exactly what is going to happen, right? If you think about the various propositions, you'll have the back and forth, the arguments for and the arguments against that various folks have wrote about, and who endorses it, etc. Well, if you ignore all that and you go to the back of this guide, you will see that there's the text of it. And this text is extremely, it's extremely dry typically. It's, might put you to sleep if you have insomnia. However, it's a really good example of low context communication. Fragile interpersonal bonds also is characteristic of it because, again, it's individualistic culture, right? You have probably numerous friends from a variety of contexts. You might have your school friends, you might have your work friends, your high school friends, etc. And especially with the friends that you have recently met, I mean, think about this class. How many of you are going to actually spend time with folks after this class ends, right? That you have low context communication because we're not talking about that tight-knit group. You have fragile interpersonal bonds. And then time is highly organized. Time is, you're using your planners, your Google calendars. It's, time is money, really. Time in individualistic culture, time is money and highly valuable and highly organized. You don't really put your relationships ahead of the various tasks, especially if it's associated to making money. So there you have Edward Hall's two types of taxonomies here. We're talking about high context and low context communication. And so for this assignment, this discussion board assignment, I'm going to want you, if you can read ahead and go through Geert Hofstede's taxonomies and recognize these are intercultural scholars who have identified these cultural patterns, this deep culture, different kinds of mental software. What I want you to do is identify various continuums, right, of taxonomies or cultural patterns that perhaps you were raised with, okay? So in the past, I've had students identify how their parents raised them on a spectrum of optimism and pessimism, where one family was highly optimistic about their prospects, about life in general, and perhaps another family was very pessimistic about it, okay? And so that could be something if that was something that you felt figures into your mental software, that could be something you write about. Others, even just attitudes towards higher education. Some families are very leery of it, feel like they don't, if you go to the university, you're not going to have real experience, right? Others are obviously highly in favor of it, okay? I'd imagine many of you are, since you're sitting here, or at least, logging on. So you can look at different, not just the taxonomies that are in Chapter 4, but also come up with your own, okay? Think about the cultural patterns that impact you. And it might not be your family. It could be, I've had people write about the military and say, I was raised to be on time, If I'm 5 minutes early, I'm late kind of attitude, right? So you could look at attitudes towards timeliness. You could look at, attitudes towards saving money, etc. So hopefully this helps you as you get to this assignment, the Cultural Patterns Discussion Board, and it kind of ties in what I already have up online, as well as, giving you a little bit more of my interpretation of this chapter and this assignment. Have a good day.